Well, Jeff, we are here. This is really going to be fun. I'm really looking forward to today. We're going to spend some time talking about the things that are you're interested in, which have to do with changing culture. But why don't we start out just finding out a little bit about you? Maybe you could just tell us about your journey, how you felt you were called into ministry, and then how you became the pastor of Rainier Assembly of God.
Sure. So I grew up in church. My mom, every time the doors were open, we were there.
Yeah.
There was no missing it. And my dad, not so much, wasn't a believer as I was growing up. But anyway, we would go all the time. And I remember like when I was, and this sounds really awkward now because the whole culture's changed, but I remember like being 5 or 6 years old, my mom would have me in a little suit, and which of course, you'd be like the biggest nerd on the planet right now,
Yeah.
but anyway then. And so, and I remember the pastor, Pastor Giles at that time, I remember him saying to me, he'd call me the little preacher boy or something like that. And there was just something in there. And I don't know that he felt that he was being prophetic or anything. I think he was just giving me a hard time. But then when I was 13 years old, there was somebody that came through on a Wednesday night, and I've tried numerous times to find out who this was.
Yeah.
But they called me out in a Wednesday night service and prophesied over me that I'd be a pastor to pastors.
Oh, wow.
And then about 6 months later, I was at a camp meeting up on the Washougal River, family camp, and George Watkins, Dr. George Watkins, who's a good friend now, was preaching, and wasn't really paying that much attention, but the Holy Spirit got hold of me, responded in the altar, and I remember he called me out in the altar and began to prophesy over me, same exact word, that I'd be a pastor to pastors and all this stuff. I thought, I don't even want to be a pastor, let alone a pastor to pastors.
Yeah.
I don't even know what that means. But I remember being slain out on the bark dust, was in a big circus type tent, and hot summer August day, I'm laid out crying on the bark dust, and I remember just laying there on my back. I didn't have glasses then, but I just remember the tears rolling down the sides of my face, and I remember thinking, I want to be able to hear God's voice like he does and be able to tell people what God has to say about him. About 15, 16, maybe 17 years ago, Gary Sigenthaler invited me to come on staff at Rainier as an associate. And I'd been an associate in other places, but he asked me to come on staff there, and I did. And he pulled me aside right after that and said, I want you to succeed me someday when I leave. And so eventually we did that. It'll be 13 years ago
Wow.
next month. I think, well, for me, it's pushed me to understand fivefold ministry better, because Gary Sigenthaler, my predecessor, he was really good at pastoring people, and I'm not very good at that. We call everybody a pastor that's in ministry, but they're actually not. They're apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers, and I'm not very pastoral. I'm not that relational. I'm actually kind of an introvert, and which is kind of funny because it's easy to get up and preach to 5,000 or 10,000 people or a couple hundred people. It's easier than going one-on-one with somebody. But I try my best in that area of ministry. When I say pastoring, I'm thinking of relationship, one-on-one, loving on people, making them feel secure in who they are. And I'm okay at that, but I don't, out of the 5, that's probably my second to least weak area. And so it's really been a challenge for me to make sure that I'm not trying to be somebody else, but to walk in the fullness of who God created me to be and not try to emulate somebody else. That actually really set me free when I realized that I could do that.
I remember John Wimber used to say, you spell faith R-I-S-K.
Yeah.
And I've always found that to be really helpful because faith is such a big part of what we do.
Absolutely.
People probably look at it and think that we're kind of gifted to do these kind of things, or somehow have got qualified because we've gone to the right school or done the right kind of training. And actually, most of it's just faith, right?
Yeah.
Most of it's just walking out your faith. And so, and a lot of your faith has to do with taking risks. So I imagine there's been a couple times along this journey where you felt like, man, I'm so glad I was willing to risk that at that particular time. What were some of the times that you can remember where we maybe have taken a big risk, but the payoff has been really good?
Wow. It's hard to talk about some of that stuff because we're in a small town. There have been different times where I had to step up and deal with somebody and have some confrontation. And I was brought up not being afraid of confrontation, and so other people in my family, they hate confrontation. I'm okay with that. I understand that. But I love the fruit of it.
Yeah.
And it's not that I would want to be in an argument or something all the time, but I love the fruit of, and in fact, I even like, if somebody comes to me and tells me that, in fact, I had somebody today, just before I got here, that came to me and said, man, I heard you say this, and I think you meant this, and man, if I did that, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, no. That's totally, totally misread it. But I was so glad that they came to me, because otherwise they'd keep walking in that misunderstanding.
Right.
And I totally don't want that to happen. And so, so I think probably the biggest risk that I've taken is being accountable to people and asking others to be accountable. And to be real honest, some people love that and some people run from that.
Right.
But I think that accountability leads to self-government. So that's a hard question, because you're asking me to put myself in the place of somebody outside of where I'm at. But I think that they probably see us as antiquated and outdated, and maybe rightfully so. But because I think that what we need to be doing is we need to be engaged in culture. And I know some of the people that are going to watch this they're not fans of the idea of the seven mountains mandate or 7 mountains culture or whatever, and that's fine. You don't have to be on board with that, but you do have to be on board with the fact that Jesus called us to impact the world.
Right.
And the fact that we're not living out the Great Commission, we're not going out and finding them. You know, we really have this whole thing backwards. It goes back to that whole pastoral apostolic thing, is that we think that the church is going to, or that the people are going to come to the church, and that's not what he called it.
It's really hard for pastors to relate to other pastors and work together on things.
Sure.
I know that in the last 5 years at Evangel, we've been trying to, whenever we do an outreach, we do it with another church because it forced us to work together.
Sure.
And I've always had this understanding, and so have a bunch of other pastors in town, that there are some things that we're never going to experience if we don't work together. We need that common focus and that diligent working together in order to see some things come.
So I feel like and I've told you this before, but I feel like I came late to the party, because I feel like you and Mark Schmutz and Chris Davis and Larry Russell and others have done such a good job to try and reach across the boundaries and try and bring churches together in unity. And I think that some people that have misunderstood have thought that that we need to have uniformity, and so they're afraid to come to the party because they don't want to compromise what they believe. Nobody's asking you to compromise what you believe. That's uniformity. That means we all dress the same, we think the same, and nobody wants that. I think that when I interact with you, and I don't have to change who I am. In fact, that's really weird if I do. When I interact with you, I want to interact as me. And I can remember being a very insecure leader about 30 years ago, working in a church and trying to be somebody that I wasn't. And it was like the ugliest thing. My wife's like, don't do that. And you know, I mean, it was a train wreck. And I'm trying to be somebody else that I wasn't. And when I finally figured out who I was and was comfortable in that, now I just show up, and some people like me and some people don't, and that's okay. And you know, you can't be all things to all people, as Paul said. But the reality is that I want to partner with things that you're good at that I'm not. I would probably just say that I would probably be repentant in talking to them in this way. Over the years, in thinking that I had the corner on something, or thinking that that I had this revelation or that revelation, I've not naming churches or naming pastors. I've never done anything like that or anything, but just within myself, have thought, man, if they could just catch up with me, or if they could just, this, that, or the other.
Right.
And I don't know if everybody does that, but I'm not responsible for everybody else. I'm only responsible for me. And but I sure regret having those thoughts, and I sure regret thinking that I knew something, because the older that I get, the more I know that I don't know.
Yeah.
And so, to me, laying down some of that thinking and laying down some of that bravado, and maybe it was, I'm sure it probably was, insecurity on my part, laying some of that down and realizing that that I'm just one little piece in the puzzle, sure changes your perspective, and I think can open up doors.
Oh, for sure.
And so I think that if we could all do that, and again, not saying that I've arrived at that point, because now I feel like I'm bragging that I've arrived, that I haven't arrived. Anyway, I'm bragging about my humility.
When you move towards humility, that's always the risk.
I'm so humble. But I think that when we lay that down and lay down our agenda, if you will, and just because I think that we all have a calling, and there's certain things that we're going to do in our churches and all that, and that's good. We need to do those things. But I think that there's some things that we could do together that, gosh, we could really accomplish some amazing things.
Yeah.
And my father-in-law said to me one time, he hadn't always been a Christian, and had been a longshoreman, and had a rough young life. And he said to me one time, when we try and get Christians together, he said, and do something together, he said, it's way harder than it was when I was unsaved. He said, when I was unsaved, if you wanted everybody to come over and help you on a project, you got a keg, and everybody showed up, and everybody helped. And you know what? Now I'm not saying we should get a keg for sure, but I don't know that there's anything that would bring us together other than us laying down our stuff, and that challenges me.
But don't you think that, given an opportunity, that's where guys will gravitate mostly? I think our assumption is that the bravado is the first choice. Sure. I think really
it's easier
once you slow down a little bit, relax a little bit. It's easier to be vulnerable. It's easier to be humble.
Sure.
It's just when we feel like things are moving so fast, and we got to keep up, and we got to compete with each other, and we've got all this stuff going on inside of us. It's hard for us just to slow down and be like Jesus to each other. I mean, he seems to talk a lot about love.
Yeah.
I mean, that seems to be a primary focus of Jesus while he was here on the earth. And
sure.
I'm not so sure that we've caught that yet. That if we could just really prefer each other and love each other, we'd find ourselves moving forward at a much faster pace together.
Absolutely.
Listen, I love the fact that you're leading in this city. I love the fact that Rainier Assembly has a voice that's not stuck, but is willing to look outside the walls of the church. And especially these last couple of years, when we've been constrained to some degree.
Sure.
Jeff, you've really made an attempt to move outside the four walls of your church and engage with us. I know you've done that in a lot of different spheres, but to have you operating that way with the other pastors in this area is a real blessing. You've got a beautiful heart. Thank you.
I appreciate that. And thanks for setting the example for us.
Oh, you bet. We really hope today's episode was helpful. You'll find more resources and content to connect with other community leaders by going to our website, cityservecowlitz.org. So, it's been a joy to walk with you, and we'll see you soon.